Want some cheat codes and talking with people about the transgender issue? Well, then keep watching. I'm Kerry Decker, and I've been documenting my journey of ministering to a transsexual Christian. I've been working with Chris since 2018. I've known him since the early 70s, and I've had plenty of conversations with him and have gained a lot of insights from this journey that we've been on together. And I hope to share a little bit of that with you today, but particularly how to have a conversation with others about this important topic. And what I've done is I've created an acrostic that will help you with remembering how to talk or have a meaningful conversation about this issue. And it's based on the word binary, binary. And the B stands for biology. We talked about that in episode 7. And so if you'd like to get some of the content that relates to the B there, you can go back and watch episode 7. But today we're going to focus on impossibility. That's the next letter in our acrostic. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. I have a confession to make that my wife and I are big crime show buffs. We enjoy watching different police procedural dramas on TV, and particularly British TV. We have a few of our favorites that we follow there. And it's always interesting to me how that an investigator can find a body out in nature somewhere and determine whether or not that there was foul play involved, but not just that, but also the sex of the individual, particularly if there's a high degree of decomposition that they can determine the sex of that individual even then. And so that let's just kind of use this metaphor for a moment to think about this whole issue of transgenderism and the impossibility of transitioning to another sex. And that suppose the police found a badly decomposed body in the woods. Only the skeleton remained, as well as some personal effects of the deceased and a few other items. So we got the skeleton, and we have the personal effects of the deceased, some of those, and a few other items there that we have to work with. Well, it's interesting to me that a forensic archaeologist or forensic pathologist can come along and work just with those skeletal remains and determine whether or not that the person that they found is a male or a female. And one of the key identifiers is the pelvis bone, the pelvic bone there. That and in men or in females, that the pelvic bone is more circular and oval, and we're talking about the pelvic inlet shape. And from what I can tell, but I'm no expert in all of this, but from what I can tell, we're looking at this pelvic bone from the back, and so there's the tailbone that is in view, and the pelvic inlet is that opening in the pelvic structure. In females, that's more circular and oval, and in males, it's more of a heart shape. And actually, someone who's trained in this can determine the sex of the individual just by looking at the pelvic bone, and they can predict it over 90% accuracy. Now, I'm no expert, but I'm going to venture to say that this is the pelvis of a female, because it looks to me like that pelvic inlet is more of an oval shape than it is a heart shape. So, but we not only have the pelvis that can be a factor in helping to identify whether or not the remains belong to a man or a woman, and another one is the skull. And there are certain features of the skull, including the brow. And in men, the brow of the skull is more prominent than in women. And here again, I'm just hazarding a guess, but it looks to me like this might be the skull of a female here. And those who are trained in this area, that they can determine to about 80% accuracy whether or not a skull belongs to a male or a female. Now, it's not just the brow that is a determining factor. There's other features of the skull, but it's above my pay grade to go into any depths on those aspects there. But another bone that will give us a good understanding of whether or not that a person is a male or a female is the femur or other long bones in the body. And to the expert eye, they can just look at a femur and tell whether or not that femur belongs to a man or a woman. And they can predict that with over 80% accuracy. So you can see here right now that just by dealing with skeletal remains is that we can be pretty confident that the body that we find out in the decomposed body that we may find out in nature somewhere, that we can determine whether or not that belongs to a man or a woman. But then if they're able to get some DNA samples from that body, that the numbers go up to precisely 100%, where they can determine whether or not it's a man or a woman. And in this case, with the XY chromosome being present, that we can be certain that the remains that are found out at a crime scene belongs to a man. Even though my stock photos, I got to go with what I got, and that my stock photos may illustrate a different conclusion. At least it kind of gets us in the ballpark of understanding what's going on here. But let's, just for the sake of argument, say that there are other factors that are found out at the crime scene, and that would include things like the clothing of the individual, let's say long hair that is present, perhaps breast implants that had not decomposed, and maybe a driver's license that indicated on the driver's license that the person is not male, but female. Now, the question is that what are we going to go with in a case like that? Are we going to go with the biological conclusion, or the conclusions that are drawn from the biological facts? Or are we going to go with these secondary issues of whether or not that this person who was found at the crime scene is a male or a female? And so when it comes to identification of our hypothetical victim here, is that we have to ask the question, is it a man or is it a woman? And I think it's fair to say that no amount of gender-affirming treatment changes the fundamental biological realities of any individual. And as we've said before, that never in the history of the world has a man become a woman. And I stand by that statement, even though it's not one that I initially uttered, is that I still think that makes fundamental sense. Even with our hormones and surgery, men do not become a woman. or a man does not become a woman. Now, let's just go ahead and think a little bit further about this for a moment, and suppose that somebody is just is really conflicted about their identity, and that they are certain that they've been born in the wrong body. And so what they decide to do is that they decide that they're going to transition. I looked up that word transition, and it's the idea of changing from one thing into another. And in this case, that individual would change, is seeking to change from being a male or man to a woman. Now, here's an interesting question to raise about this, and that's just simply this: is that if that's the race that an individual is running, well, how do they know when they've crossed the finish line? So in other words, when does a man become a woman? When does a man become a woman? Is it when they say, I identify as a woman, and so that's all that's necessary for a man to become a woman? Is it wearing women's clothing? Is that the key marker? When does a man become a woman? I think that's a fair question to ask. Is that when they have changed their social or legal presentation? When they are taking hormones? When the man has had breast implants? Has all of a sudden he become a woman? Is it when he has genital surgery? Is it when he's had facial feminization surgery? Is it when he's had a tracheal shave, and in other words, that his Adam's apple has been shaved down from a more distinct male presentation to that of a female? Or maybe when he's had voice modification surgery, come to find out that that's a thing, that you can actually change the pitch of a person's voice. Or is it something else? I was surprised to find, because I went in and I asked AI some of these questions, and I was surprised to find that AI says this, is that since gender identity is an internal sense of self. Now, this is really important because what it says there is that gender identity is a state of mind. But that's not what's claimed. Oftentimes, in the literature, or when you hear people talk about this topic, is that they're not saying it's strictly a mental state. They say things like gender identity is a social construct. And so, in other words, it's something that's determined, what society determines what's masculine and feminine, and then individuals find themselves in crisis because they don't identify along those lines. But I'm not so certain you can have it both ways here, because what AI says here is that since gender identity is an internal sense of self, not a social construct, but it's an internal sense of self, it is not possible to tell if someone is trans simply from their behavior, or their appearance, or their behavior. Now think about what that's saying there. Is that what's that's claiming is that a person that has no markers of, let's say a man who has no markers of either being feminine or looking feminine, absolutely zero markers of either appearing feminine or acting feminine, is that all that is sufficient for that individual to be a woman a trans woman is to say, I identify as a woman. And that's it. But is this that when a man becomes a woman? You see, I don't even think that's possible for a man to become a woman. I still stand by that statement. I didn't originally utter it, but I stand by that statement that says that never in the history of the world has a man become a woman. Now, I think we're fundamentally confused about that in society today, but because we oftentimes we talk about transsexual persons. So, in other words, they have changed from one thing. The idea of transitioning is changing from one thing into another. But as we'll see in our next slide, is that this is just fundamentally impossible. It cannot be done. Let's say instead of looking at the finish line of when does a man become a woman, let's ask the question of what happens after they've run the race and an individual is convinced that he is now a woman. And this is the case with Chris, is that he's convinced that he's a woman. And but here's what happens. And even though Chris has gone through many of these, transitions, if you will, is that he's had surgery on his genitals, he's had breast implants, he's had the tracheal shave, he's had hair removal from his beard. He's taking hormones. That he's had facial feminization. He dresses as a woman. That he has changed his birth certificate, his social security, and when he was driving, he changed his driver's license. He's in far too bad of health right now to drive at all. But let's say if you've gone down the race as far as Chris has, or even further, is that here's what does not change. The person's genetic makeup does not change. Chris had a karyotype test, and it came back that he has XY chromosomes, and so nothing. No, you can alter a lot of your anatomy, and you can change your appearance, but your chromosomes remain the same. Chris does not have female reproductive organs. That includes there's no uterus or ovaries, no fallopian tubes. That all of the surgery in the world does not give an individual the female or reproductive organs. Chris has no capacity for pregnancy. You say, but wait a minute, there's a lot of infertile women. Yes, but they're women. And that is that no transsexual woman has ever gotten pregnant. Now, that so in other words, no man who now identifies as a woman has ever gotten pregnant. And that individual has no capacity for menstruation. That individual's skeletal structure remains the same, as we said. The pelvic bone remains the same. The skull remains the same. And you can shave off various aspects of those bones and various features of those bones, but all you've done is you've had a surgical procedure. You didn't become a woman following that procedure. That after you've run the race, that you're, if you're a man and you're transitioning into a woman, is that your muscle fiber composition remains the same. You still have a man's muscle fiber composition. You cannot produce natural estrogen. And I just learned this today. There's a lot of things I don't know about this, but I just learned this today, is that your cardiovascular capacities remain the same. And it was interesting to me to learn that men and women have different hearts, and those different hearts are not just a matter of size, is that they're different capacities that those hearts have. And so just a mere so just attempting to change the cosmetic appearance of yourself into a woman changes nothing other than you've gone through a number of surgical procedures, and at the end of the day, dare I say it, you're no more woman than you were at the beginning of the race. You were no more woman. And here again is one of these things that I discovered in my research on this topic, is that men and women's immune system traits are different. And so nothing changes other than your cosmetic appearance. And if we're prepared to say that that's what a woman is, I think that that's a pretty delusional stance to take. And I think it's a pretty harmful stance to take as a society. And I think that we are seeing that being worked out in the season that we have gone through and are going through with respect to social policies regarding transgender persons. So at the end of the day, that when we're talking about this acrostic, that the I in our binary acrostic stands for impossibility. And it's just fundamentally impossible for a man to become a woman. Now, he can alter his body parts, and he can change his cosmetic appearance. But even when you've gone all the way down as far as you can go in this process, nothing has turned you into a woman. And so I would encourage you to begin to think more clearly about these issues, and to love people who are struggling with gender identity and transgender individuals with true Christian love. And we're going to talk in future episodes about how that plays out in a very practical way. But that's it for today, and I hope that you'll join me the next time as we go through our binary acrostic here. I'll see you